that band of brothers, intrepid and unchangeable, who, like the Greeks at Thermopylae, stood in the gap in the defense of their country, from the first glimmering of the revolution in the horizon through all its rising light to its perfect day. End quote. Such is how John Adams described the 5 Lee brothers of Stratford Hall, that glimmering collection of founding fathers who did so much to shape the direction of America and add luster to their glorious name. But before the sons of Stratford could alter the course of history, before the world of those 5 Lees extended back beyond the pleasures of the Potomac Plantation society in which they lived, and of course of Williamsburg politics, and reached to such faraway lands and places as Philadelphia, Edinburgh, London, Paris, and even Berlin, there had to be a master builder who laid the foundations of their wealth, their physical seat, and their continental vision. That man was Thomas Lee, their father, the father of the founding fathers, the great-granduncle of Robert E. Lee, and the builder of Stratford Hall. This dynast, Thomas Lee, was a younger son in an era governed by primogeniture. He was a rough frontier autodidact in a society that prized polish. He was a man who looked at the falls of the Potomac and saw the highway to a Western empire long before his contemporaries dared to look past the Blue Ridge. He was a great man, a great builder, a great accumulator, and he sired the American Revolution. This is the story of Thomas Lee, the visionary builder of the Lee dynasty, the intrepid frontier aristocrat. He built a small inheritance into a great fortune and paved the way for the American Revolution by establishing some of its greatest men. Let's tell the story of his life. To understand Thomas Lee, we must first examine the world into which he was born in the year 1690. His birthplace was the Machodoc Plantation of Richard Lee II, whose life we covered last time, that previous episode, a sprawling property situated near the banks of the Potomac River in Westmoreland County. Virginia was, at this moment of his birth, undergoing that profound transition that led to the golden age of Virginia history, as we discussed in our episode on it, that era of the earliest pioneers who lived in rude wooden cabins set amidst tree stumps was giving way to the more settled, self-conscious plantation elite with larger holdings that characterized the later period. The yeomen were giving way to the great fortunes and the gentry who used them to rule, and the Lees were such a family that ruled, led first by the great dynast Richard Lee I, then preserved and stabilized by the arch-Tory Richard Lee II, known to history as the Scholar. While the Scholar preserved the fortune, he did not grow it overly much, if at all, and so a fourth son, like young Thomas Lee, faced something of a hurdle. While the law of primogeniture was not absolute in Virginia, and the first families did divide their fortunes somewhat, younger sons were generally expected to make do with less, particularly if the fortune was not overly vast. We covered this in our episode on the first families. Such was the case with Thomas. For him, there would be no grand voyage across the Atlantic for preparatory training at Eton, residence at Oxford, or legal studies at the Inns of Court. His older brothers would get those benefits, but the ongoing tobacco price depression and his status as a younger son meant he would not. He would instead be taught the basics by a tutor, while his older brother, Richard III, set up in London as a prosperous tobacco merchant, and his brother Philip established himself on the family land in Maryland, the famous Blenheim plantation that Richard II had fought so hard to keep in the family, as we covered in the episode on his life. Thomas, meanwhile, was left a somewhat anemic patrimony of between 12 and 1,500 acres, the Bishop's Neck Plantation in Northumberland and Rehoboth in Maryland, though it should be noted that is far more than most new men in Virginia had. Still, it was small for a man of such great family name. Still, it was to prove the basis of his great fortune, which made him not just the foremost Virginian of his day and the largest landowner the Lee family ever produced, possessing over 30,000 acres in the Northern Neck and along the frontier at the time of his death. Describing the spirit that drove him to this, author Lewis Potts, in the book Arthur Lee, A Virtuous Revolutionary, notes, quote, "Despite meager formal education and a relatively slim inheritance of 1,200 acres, Thomas proved himself equal to the emigrant in enterprising spirit and acquisitive zeal." End quote. Thomas possessed what his son would later describe as strong natural parts. He had inherited an unusual share of his grandfather Richard Lee I's physical stamina, determination, and enterprise. Deeply sensitive to his lack of classical training and refusing to be defined as an educated rustic, Thomas undertook a monumental task of self-education. After he was fully grown, working by the flickering light of candles after long days managing the plantation or searching for land deals, he taught himself Latin and Greek from textbooks on his own. He forced his way into the world of letters that defined a gentleman through sheer force of will, developing an incredibly sharp mind for business and land acquisition, and a tolerable competence in the classics. Describing Thomas Lee during this period in his life, historian Richard Morton notes in his History of Colonial Virginia, quote, Thomas Lee, being a younger son in Richard Lee II's large family, received only a small inheritance and no classical education. But Thomas inherited an unusual share of ability, physical stamina, determination, and strength of character. Since a knowledge of the classics was considered an essential part of every gentleman's equipment, he taught himself Latin and Greek from textbooks. Early in life, he began to acquire a fortune in land and goods, end quote. Thomas also realized that if he was to survive and add luster to the family name, if he was to build his branch of the Lee family of Virginia into a name that could stand alongside the great dynasties of the Tidewater, he would have to outwork, outthink, and outmaneuver the very oligarchs who ruled the colony. And it was in 1711 that his opportunity arrived. This was the decisive event in the life of 21-year-old Thomas Lee, and it occurred when he ran directly athwart the course of the most powerful man in Virginia in this day, King Carter. As we have noted before, King Charles II had granted a colossal swath of land, some 5 to 6 million acres lying between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers, stretching from the Chesapeake Bay all the way westward to the unmapped headwaters in the Allegheny Mountains, to a group of court favorites. By the early 18th century, this massive private domain had consolidated into the hands of Lady Catherine Fairfax, the daughter of Lord Culpeper. Describing this system in his book, The Lees of Virginia, author Paul Nagel notes, quote, thanks to royal generosity, the proprietor was nominally owner of the huge area between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. This meant that Virginians could purchase land in the region only through the proprietor's agent in the colony. Grants were approved on a kind of leasehold basis, requiring that the claimant annually pay to the proprietor a sum, usually in tobacco, known as a quit rent. This was collected by the agent. It was work needing detailed knowledge of the roughly 5 million acres in the proprietary. End quote. For years, the resident manager, the agent of this empire in Virginia, had been Robert King Carter of Stratford Hall. Carter was a man of such immense wealth, imperious bearing, and ferociously energetic acquisitiveness that his contemporaries simply called him King Carter. King Carter ruled the Northern Neck with an iron hand, but he was also engaged in a bitter political struggle with the royal governor, Alexander Spotswood, and his management of Lady Fairfax's estate had become increasingly casual and self-serving. The interests of Lady Fairfax were among the least of his concerns, and she sensed it, realizing, or at least suspecting, that he was ripping her off. Sensing that her broad domain was not yielding the income it should, Lady Fairfax looked to London for advice, and she turned to Thomas Corbin, a prominent London merchant whose commercial house had been deeply identified with the Virginia tobacco trade for generations. Corbin happened to be the maternal uncle of young Thomas Lee, and Corbin saw an opportunity to advance his family's interests on the Potomac. He recommended that Lady Fairfax sever her relations with King Carter, and he nominated as the new Virginia agents his brother-in-law, Edmund Jennings, and Jennings's brilliant 21-year-old nephew, Thomas Lee. This she did, much to the advantage of young Thomas and the fury of King Carter. Because Jennings was residing in England at the time, the entire burden of organizing the new agency fell squarely on the shoulders of young Thomas. And in December 1711, Lady Fairfax's power of attorney was officially recorded in the Westmoreland County Court. Thomas Lee was now the agent. This appointment sent shockwaves through the colonial oligarchy. A 21-year-old youth with no formal education and a negligible inheritance had supplanted the most powerful aristocrat in North America. King Carter was enraged. The coup ignited a bitter, personal, legal, and political feud between the Carters and the Lees that would fester for well over a decade and caused no small degree of future political squabbling. But Thomas Lee was not intimidated by this and set about throwing himself into the management of the proprietary with a meticulous enthusiasm and thoroughness that captivated his employers and left a permanent mark on Virginia's history. He moved the proprietary land office directly into the old Lee house in Westmoreland, where he and his brother Henry were leasing the Machodoc property from their older brother, Richard III, still in London, for the nominal rent of a peppercorn a year. That commercial relationship between London and Virginia was valuable for the reasons of economy and trade we covered last time, and Richard III had no intention of moving to Virginia, so he just let them rent it for a nominal sum. In any case, Thomas revolutionized the administration of the land records from this outpost quite to the benefit of the Fairfax family. Namely, he inaugurated the practice of entering the detailed surveyor's plats directly alongside the land grants in the official books, a method that has endeared his memory to modern antiquarians and historians, and also meant the Fairfaxes weren't getting ripped off anymore, as they probably had been by King Carter. And so for 4 long years, Thomas Lee was in charge of an incredible 6 million acres, the whole Northern Neck. In the name of Lady Catherine Fairfax, this young man exercised the ancient prerogatives of the British Crown, granting vast tracts of land and collecting the annual quit rents from his own neighbors, all in exchange for a generous fee, of course. It paid well. But it was more valuable than just the fee, particularly for the Lee family, for Thomas was doing something else during those 4 years. He was riding across, exploring, and examining the whole Northern Neck, discovering choice tracts. To administer an estate of that scale, a man had to live in the saddle. Thomas rode through the dense forests of the Piedmont, along the banks of the Rappahannock, and up the winding path of the Potomac. He went where it was safe to go and often where it was not, pushed forward both by duty and by an insatiable land hunger that mirrored his grandfather's earliest days. Every horseback ride became a scouting expedition. While representing the interests of the proprietor, Thomas was also carefully logging the locations of the richest soil, the most strategic river landings, and the most valuable transit points for future commerce. So, when his uncle Edmund Jennings finally returned to Virginia in 1716 to assume personal responsibility for the agency, Thomas didn't step back and fade into obscurity, but instead began to deploy the invaluable intelligence he had collected for his own personal benefit. He began to patent lands with a brilliant eye for long-term commercial value, and in 1718 he secured a large patent for 4,200-acre tract of land in what was then Richmond County, a region where the town of Warrenton stands today. Interestingly, the original colonial survey reveals a boundary line that almost perfectly resembles the shape of a Virginia ham. But legally, the title to this Piedmont land was highly contentious, as the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations, claimed sovereignty over the entire Piedmont region, citing a treaty from 1684, and they wouldn't formally relinquish their rights until the Treaty of Albany in 1722. Yet Thomas Lee's title was perfectly secure in the halls of Williamsburg, if not on the banks of Cedar Run. Still, Thomas's eyes were fixed even farther north and west, near the very edge of the unmapped frontier. He pushed his land acquisitions up to the Great and Little Falls of the Potomac, a rugged, narrow channel known in colonial times as the Spout. He understood that whoever controlled the transit points around the unnavigable falls would ultimately control the commerce of the interior, and that such control would be quite valuable. So, over the course of several years, through the subsequent agency of his old rival King Carter, Thomas systematically accumulated 16,000 acres of prime land in what is now Loudoun County, stretching along either bank of Broad Run. In an earnest, persistent attempt to stamp his legacy upon the landscape, he tried to rename the local waterway Lee's Creek. That didn't work. It's remembered as Goose Creek today, and that's the name that prevailed in the geography books. But he secured something of a victory as a town arose on those lands many years later, and it was named Leesburg in his honor. To secure the financial independence necessary to maintain these massive holdings and to accumulate them in the first place, Thomas looked again to the water, and in 1712, utilizing the concentrated, helpful political influence of his father and uncles, he secured a very lucrative crown appointment, naval officer and receiver of customs for the South Potomac. So in the British mercantile system, the post of naval officer was an absolute gold mine. The naval officer was the collector of all shipping duties along the riverfront. So, in addition to a very handsome, nice base salary, the office legally permitted Thomas or any other naval officer to claim a 10% commission on all duties collected on enumerated colonial exports. In this case, tobacco, furs, skins, lumber. Every merchant vessel that cleared the Potomac River, every hogshead of tobacco that sailed for London, every bundle of deer skins traded from the back country, paid a direct tithe into the hands of Thomas Lee, which he could then use to accumulate more and more land. By his late 20s, the younger son, who had been left out of his father's will, had transformed himself into a wealthy merchant, an elite land speculator, and a formidable presence along the Potomac shore. He had built a fortune out of nothing but intellect, rigor, and skill, and some luck. And now he was ready to build a house worthy of his name. In the spring of 1722, Thomas Lee cemented his entry into the highest echelon of the Virginia aristocracy through marriage. This was a persistent trait of the Lee family. Sometime between May 23rd and May 30th of that year, he wed Hannah Harrison Ludwell. Hannah was a daughter of one of the most powerful dynastic families in the Old Dominion. Her family's country seat was Green Spring, the legendary brick estate, one of the first in the state, if not the first in the state, near Jamestown that had once belonged to Governor Sir William Berkeley himself. By marrying Hannah, Thomas brought the vast wealth and concentrated political connections, along with the extensive landed estates, of the Ludwells into the Lee dynasty. It was also a good love match, the marriage, and the two got along quite well. So for the next few years of their married life, Thomas and Hannah made their home at the old Machodoc homestead, a pleasant estate situated in Coupal Parish, Westmoreland County, which they continued to lease from Thomas's older brother, Richard, and his family. It was a comfortable life, anchored by Thomas's expanding mercantile business and his responsibilities as a gentleman justice of the peace. Together, they began to raise a family, losing 3 children in infancy, but successfully rearing 8 offspring, 6 sons and 2 daughters who would inherit their parents' fierce intelligence and relentless energy, as we've already noted. But on a bitter winter night in January 1729, the fragile illusion of frontier peace was shattered in an instant for this family. So to understand what happened, we need to look at the social crisis that was confronting Virginia in this period. A massive influx of indentured convicts had been transported from the jails of London to Virginia, where they were supposed to work as indentured servants. The Virginia gentry was unhappy with this, viewing them as a pernicious crew and looking at them with fear and hostility, particularly because they worried that letting in these convicts would cause trouble for the colony, would bring crime. Previously, they'd been able to sleep with their doors and windows open, but bringing all the felons to the Tidewater kicked off a spree of robberies and violent crime. It was Thomas Lee who, as a prominent magistrate and justice of the peace for Westmoreland County, had to deal with it, and he had been unyielding in his duty when he received complaints from local citizens about a number of convicted felons who had been transported from the mother country to Virginia to be sold as indentured labor. In fact, he had personally apprehended and strictly punished a gang of these transported felons. The convicts vowed revenge and got it in the dead of night. While his entire household was asleep, the gang silently surrounded Thomas's Machodoc manor house and broke into the outhouses, plundered the family's silver and valuables, and then set the wooden mansion ablaze. The fire spread with catastrophic speed. This was a wooden house, after all, and within minutes, the old wooden structure was completely engulfed in roaring flames. The family was trapped on the upper floor, and in a scene of sheer desperation, just imagine this. The air is thick with suffocating smoke, and Thomas and Hannah have to throw their 3 young children out of an upper story window into the freezing night air, and then leap out after them in nothing but their shirts on their backs. They saved nothing but their lives and what they were wearing. Barely 2 minutes after they cleared the window, according to what we know, the entire roof of the house collapsed and the house fell in on itself in a mountain of white-hot embers. The disaster of this was immense. A young servant girl, a white indentured servant, from Britain, was trapped inside the house and burned to death in her bed. The plantation outbuildings, the barns, Thomas's extensive commercial stores were all destroyed as well, being reduced to ashes. The magnificent library that Thomas had inherited from his father, Richard the Scholar, was included with the house. Collection of rare texts in multiple languages entirely destroyed by the blaze. And the financial loss to Thomas was staggering. This might be an overestimate, but it was estimated by his contemporaries to exceed 50,000 pounds sterling, including close to 10,000 pounds in hard cash that was either melted and destroyed in the blaze or stolen in the raid. The present value of that 50,000 pounds would be somewhere around 20 million United States dollars today, gone in an instant. Again, we don't know the exact amount, and it's hard to do these inflation calculations, but that at least gives a rough estimate of how much he lost in cash alone. The colonial government was horrified by this assault on a crown magistrate in the line of duty, and Governor William Gooch wrote an indignant, urgent dispatch to the Lords of Trade in London, using the villainous, as he put it, destruction of Lee's home to illustrate why Virginia was being ruined by the importation of British felons. Gooch argued passionately that Thomas Lee deserved both a substantial bounty from royal coffers to help offset this disaster that arose from his courageous discharge of his judicial office, and, of course, that the transportation of felons to Virginia should stop. The British Crown relented a little bit. Queen Caroline, acting on behalf of the government, sent a bounty to Thomas Lee out of the royal quit rents. This grew in legend to be a generous, large royal gift. In reality, the bounty was quite modest, probably 200 to 300 pounds sterling, so a tiny fraction of the immense fortune that Thomas had lost in the fire. Describing this moment and this disaster in his book Tobacco Coast, which is quite good, author Arthur Pierce Middleton notes, quote, "It is well known that Colonel Thomas Lee's mansion was burnt down in 1729 by convicts who resented his activities as justice of the peace in suppressing crime in the Northern Neck. In 1732, the Attorney General of Virginia, John Clayton, requested and received a higher salary because, quote, the increase of criminals of late years, especially since the importation of convicts from Great Britain, end quote, occasioned him additional, quote, trouble in the prosecution of them, end quote. Imported felons not only composed an unstable and dangerous portion of colonial society, given the crimes of violence, but they also were responsible for spreading disease among the inhabitants, end quote. So bringing the felons over was a disaster, most of all for Thomas Lee. To rebuild his life and achieve his architectural ambitions, Thomas Lee couldn't rely on royal charity. He had to rely back on his own business acumen, his customs commissions, and the extraordinary efforts of his wife, Hannah. But he did rebuild his fortune and kept building his life. Particularly, he had long had his eyes fixed on a magnificent, rugged property located about 20 miles farther up the Potomac River from Machodoc, a tract known as the Cliffs. He had purchased 1,443 acres of this prime riverfront property from Nathaniel Pope long before the fire, and the site was spectacular, a line of high, craggy cliffs that commanded a sweeping view of the wide Potomac River winding toward the horizon. Describing his purchase of it in the Lees of Virginia, Paul C. Nagel notes, quote, after Edmund Jennings returned to Virginia in 1716, Thomas officially handed the agency to him, although retaining administrative management at Machodoc until 1719, when Lady Fairfax died. Thomas was now 29, an age then reckoned the prime of life. It was time he should think about what great estate he might create. Since his inheritance had not included an impressive piece of property, Thomas eyed a site of 1,443 acres, perched 20 miles up the Potomac from Machodoc. It offered one of the most imposing presences in Virginia, since its water frontage displayed white-tinted, towering palisades, which gave the land its name, the Cliffs. The place sat on an extraordinary geological formation. Only in 3 other locations, Los Angeles, Austria, Belgium, can one see a similar compaction of sea matter from the Miocene era. Perhaps because of its grandeur, the Cliffs was one of the earliest locations purchased along the Potomac. In 1651, Nathaniel Pope, ancestor of George Washington, acquired it, after which it descended through Pope's widow, who returned to England, to another Nathaniel Pope. It was with him that Thomas Lee had to deal. So off to England he went in November 1716, leaving Henry to manage affairs at Machodoc. Thomas returned to claim the cliffs in August 1718, paying £375 sterling, including all slaves, livestock, and other contents. Eventually, it became the site of Stratford, Lee's most famous plantation. End quote. Sadly, it was around that same time, 1718, that his brother Richard Lee III died in London, and henceforth he rented Machodoc from his brother's widow, Martha Lee, on the same easy terms as before. So that's why he was still in it many years later when it was burned down, and then to resume the narrative. In any case, Lee had the Stratford estate well in hand by the 1730s, as well as the Machodoc plantation, as just mentioned, though now without a house thanks to the roving gang of criminals. And so throughout the 1730s, Thomas poured his energy and his gradually recovering capital into finishing the construction of a colossal, fortress-like brick mansion on the Cliffs property. He named it Stratford Hall, in affectionate remembrance of his grandfather's ancient English home at Stratford Langton in Essex. And he had been building Stratford before the fire, but of course he had much more of an impetus to quickly finish it after the fire destroyed his other home. Stratford Hall was unlike any other house in North America. It wasn't built for grace, and it lacked the prettiness of the Georgian-style mansions of his fellow Virginians, but it was instead built for solidity, assurance, permanence. More than 1 million heavy bricks were baked directly on the premises out of the native Potomac clay to build walls 2 feet thick. The mansion was shaped in a huge H, and it used those massive brick walls that rose out of the ground to look like a defensive bastion against the wild landscape and what might be hiding in it. It was really an architectural symbol of a new America, individual, self-reliant, unformed, but massive. Describing the home and its legacy, A.R. Riggs, in the book The 9 Lives of Arthur Lee, notes, quote, Stratford Hall displays vigor and strength, but its unknown designer denied it the elegance of the Georgian homes erected by other Potomac River barons. Its ambiance must have been devastating when Thomas and Hannah Lee occupied their new home, with the formal classical interior and the fortress-like facade of a full 90 feet. If architecture can speak, that ponderous H-shaped pile of brick and mortar, its roof crowned by twin chimney clusters enclosing viewing pavilions, expressed the aspirations of a presumptuous tobacco prince. More than a home, and not a simple challenge to the economic status quo, Squire Lee Stratford represented a boastful personal call to social and political power. Thomas Lee was then in his 30s, and he stood a score of years away from the lofty eminence of President of His Majesty's Council and acting governor of the Royal Colony of Virginia. He must have been aware that his lavish manor house laid similar obligations on his descendants. The interior walls of the Great Hall, with its pine paneling and elaborately carved pilasters, capitals, and cornices, could swallow up the entire cast for a fancy dress ball, and they were expansive enough to display almost as many portraits of successive leaders of the Stratford clan. End quote. And as he built up the house, so he built up the new plantation surrounding it. Describing this massive operation in his book First Founding Father, Harlow Giles Unger notes, quote, Thomas Lee had expanded his property adjacent to Stratford Hall from its original 1,500 acres to about 4,000 acres, with vineyards, orchards, tobacco fields, and fields of grain stretching to the horizon. And at its core stood the magnificent manor, Stratford Hall, atop a bluff overlooking the Potomac River on Virginia's Northern Neck, the northernmost of 3 giant peninsulas that reached eastward into Chesapeake Bay. Below, on river's edge, beneath Stratford Hall, stood a mill, a warehouse, a landing for ocean-going transports, a ship's store, and a fully equipped shipyard to build, repair, and service ships. Scattered about the property was housing for as many as 100 slaves, servants, and workers, including weavers, carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths, shipwrights, millers, herdsmen, weavers, tailors, shoemakers, and other craftsmen. In effect, Thomas Lee, Richard Henry Lee's father, had transformed a corner of Virginia into a thriving, self-sufficient English waterfront community. End quote. That port infrastructure mentioned above, enabled by the prime position along the Potomac that Thomas Lee chose for Stratford, became particularly valuable for the family as Thomas's infrastructure build-out and political influence turned it into a thriving mercantile location. This is noted in Richard Henry Lee of Virginia by Kent J. McGaughey, who notes, quote, Lee's Landing was one of several ports of call selected by the British Crown to serve colonial Virginia. Richard Henry Lee's father, Thomas Lee, built a modest dock system that could accommodate the ocean-going vessels that were so vital to Virginia's economy. As Richard Henry sat on the docks, he could look to the northwest and see the majestic white cliffs that first attracted his father to this area. To the east, he saw the wide Potomac River that seemed to have no end as it flowed into Chesapeake Bay. The landing provided a convenient place for the Lees to store their annual tobacco crop as they waited for the ships to transport it to England. In addition to the wharves and piers jutting out into the Potomac River, Thomas Lee had a number of warehouses built in accordance with government contracts to hold tobacco and other dry goods. As a result, Lee's Landing served as an important link between the tidewater planters of the Northern Neck and British markets. End quote. While the Stratford Hall estate was being built, Thomas Lee was increasingly absent. His rising political responsibilities, a career begun when he was first elected to the House of Burgesses for Westmoreland County in 1720, required his constant presence in the colonial capital of Williamsburg, a grueling journey that required 4 full days of travel by horseback and sloop. Consequently, the real commander over the Stratford Empire at this period was most often Hannah Ludwell Lee, his wife. If Thomas ruled the political halls of the colony, Hannah ruled the domestic kingdom at home. She was a woman of extraordinary executive capacity. For example, a surviving bill of exchange from 1734 reveals her name written independently as the principal director of major commercial transactions, a legal and financial status that was rarely accorded to any Virginia woman of this period, particularly while her husband was still alive. But Hannah had it. Hannah also supervised the clearing of the fields, managed the complex accounts of the plantation, and directed the heavy labor required to complete the great mansion. Thomas so admired his wife's exceptional capacity for management that he preferred to leave her in charge of their home, finding a sense of peace and knowing that Stratford was secure under her watchful eye, particularly as he engaged in politics or other endeavors. And as it was finished and lived in, Stratford Hall became more than a house. It became the physical embodiment of the family's triumph over disaster, the secure fortress that would nurture the generation of revolutionaries who would soon tear down an empire. And more than that, it became a bastion of the Lee family's social power, as it gave them an excellent location in which to host the sort of social events that built matrimonial alliances, political alliance, and social prestige, all of which were the currency of greatness in this frontier land. Describing as much, both regarding the events and how Stratford played into the Lee family's dominance of them, in his Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, Kent McGaughey notes, quote, "The great families that resided along the James and Potomac rivers gathered together at seasonal balls and festivals. These social events provided opportunities for parents and children to associate with their peers. All would feast and dance together, participate in a variety of games, including horse and boat races. If a child of one of the great planters lacked the social graces, of which dancing was considered among the most important skills, the embarrassment could have a devastating and lingering effect, lasting well into his adult years. The reason is that these social gatherings were frequently where young men and women met their future wives and husbands. Festivals of this sort required extensive planning and preparation. When the Lees hosted such gatherings, slaves would roast an entire calf or a hog for at least 2 days in the kitchen adjacent to the great house. Food prepared in this quantity would guarantee that the Lees' guests would never be in want of something to eat while attending such events at Stratford Hall. Frequently, these festivals would last several days, allowing for ample time for the hosts to ingratiate themselves with their neighbors and other visitors. Thomas Lee sponsored many such events and delighted in bringing guests to Stratford Hall. He was meticulous in matters concerning the appearance of his home, both indoors and outdoors. As a carriage bringing visitors to Stratford broke through a thick grove of trees, they would catch their first glimpse of the great house. The drivers steered their carriages around toward the eastern end of the house, thus allowing guests to pass by the beautifully sculpted gardens. The Lees would then greet their guests as they climbed out of their carriages. A brief glance northward afforded them a view of the Potomac River before they ascended the wide staircase that would take them into Stratford's Great Hall. End quote. As Stratford rose above the Potomac cliffs, Thomas Lee's political ascent was moving with an equally powerful momentum. His public career, like that of all Virginians, began in the trenches of local government, serving as a gentleman justice of Westmoreland County and as the naval officer for the Potomac. But Thomas's ambitions were fixed on the colonial legislature, and in 1720, after proving himself at the local level, he ran for a seat in the House of Burgesses, representing Westmoreland County. The election did cause an immense commotion in the community, as this young political novice achieved a stunning upset victory, being, quote, unduly elected over Daniel McCarty, an entrenched political veteran who had represented the county for years and was currently serving as the Speaker of the House. McCarty also happened to be Thomas's own brother-in-law, adding a layer of familial drama to the political victory, though the two apparently remained on good enough terms despite the drama. In any case, in the House of Burgesses, Thomas quickly established himself as a formidable intellect with a pragmatic focus, and he generally deployed his influence to protect the commercial interests of the Tidewater planters while laying the groundwork for his next major leap to power. This came in 1732 when he reached the inner circle of colonial governance and was appointed by the Crown to the Governor's Council of State, which, as we've talked about before, was a small, very elite body composed of only about a dozen men who served for life and who served simultaneously as the governor's private cabinet, the upper house of the colonial legislature, and the Supreme Court of the colony. In an ironic twist of fate, the seat to which Thomas Lee was appointed was the vacancy created by the death of his old, imperious rival, King Carter. The younger son, who had supplanted Carter as land agent 20 years earlier, had now stepped right on into his seat as the center of political power. This promotion to the council certainly powered the expansion of Thomas's private fortune. The office carried with it a handsome annual salary and brought a number of lucrative perks and land grant privileges, which provided Thomas with the steady influx of capital necessary to finally complete the extensive construction and decoration of the Stratford estate, while also continuing to build his fortune in land. And it gave him the ability to dole out some patronage to his family. With his seat on the council secure, Thomas passed the lucrative office of naval officer for the Potomac down to his younger brother, Henry Lee, ensuring that the critical customs revenues and shipping commissions remained tightly controlled within the family line, while Thomas focused his immense energies on global diplomacy and westward expansion. Thomas Lee had become a master of Virginia politics. He was no longer some marginal figure fighting for recognition as a younger son, but was rather an undisputed leader of the political and social oligarchy that ruled the largest colony in British North America. He had risen from being a younger son with a paltry inheritance to one of the greatest and most powerful men of his day. But never content to rest upon his laurels, even from these commanding heights, he started to look westward. While most of his contemporary planters were content to look east toward the London tobacco markets, Thomas looked west toward the mountains. He possessed a continental vision of America's future and meditated deeply on the vast valleys of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, famously declaring that Virginia's imperial borders stretched all the way to the, quote, Great South Sea, including California, end quote. This was a vision sparked by Governor Spotswood, whose Knights of the Golden Circle expedition, as we covered in a fun earlier episode, turned the eyes of numerous forward-thinking Virginians to the rich lands of the West. Noting the effect of that expedition upon Thomas and his a-topping people, author Emory G. Evans notes, quote, Alexander Spotswood's exploratory trip across the mountains in 1716 and his subsequent acquisition of large amounts of land in the new county of Spotsylvania had turned the eyes of wealthy Virginians westward. Robert Beverly and Thomas Lee, among others, had been involved with Spotswood, and it was Beverly's son William who in the 1720s and early 1730s began aggressively to explore the possibility of acquiring land west of the mountains. Time was of an essence because northern men were busily taking up land and bringing in settlers from Pennsylvania and elsewhere, end quote. But in the 1740s, that Western vision was threatened by a looming global conflict. The French Empire was moving aggressively to encircle the British colonies, constructing a line of military forts down the back of the continent and claiming sovereignty over the entire Ohio River basin based upon early exploratory canoe trips. Thomas Lee understood that paper sovereignty was meaningless without actual settlement. Facts on the ground triumph overall. And he decided that the Almighty had designated that the North American interior was not meant for French despotism, but for English occupancy, and that it was his duty to ensure that such happened. Such was easier said than done, for before a single English family could safely cross the mountains, the colonies had to secure the consent of the actual on-the-ground rulers of the backcountry, the Iroquois Confederacy, known to the English as the Six Nations. So Thomas set about getting that consent. In May 1744, Thomas Lee was appointed diplomat-in-chief to handle this negotiation, one with immense stakes. On a beautiful spring morning, a small sloop cast off from the private landing at Stratford Hall, winding on its way by the booming of cannon, the huzzas of plantation laborers, and the mixed smiles and sighs of his gathered family. Sitting in the place of honor was Thomas Lee, the senior of two commissioners appointed by Virginia to travel north to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to enter into a grand treaty with the chiefs of the Six Nations. The Lancaster Conference was one of the most important diplomatic negotiations in early American history, if not the most important. The stakes were monumental. Untold millions of acres of fertile farms and thousands of miles of navigable rivers, the combined effect of which was to determine whether America would be hemmed in by the mountains or expand across the continent. It was Thomas Lee, who would be instrumental in determining the course of American history. For weeks, Thomas deployed his sharp legal mind and his understanding of frontier diplomacy, treating the Native American chiefs with uncharacteristic civility and respect, while relentlessly pressing for territorial concessions. The result was an immense diplomatic triumph, the Treaty of Lancaster. In exchange for substantial trade goods and financial guarantees, the Six Nations officially transferred to Virginia all their ancestral claims and territorial rights over the immense country lying west of the Great Mountains. It was this treaty that legally opened the floodgates for westward expansion, setting up the historic collision between Great Britain and France that would culminate on the Plains of Abraham, thanks to our friend George Washington, as we covered in our episode on that, to turn the paper promises of the Lancaster Treaty into physical reality. Thomas Lee organized a provocative and immense commercial enterprise. This came in 1747 when he gathered together a group of elite tidewater planters and London merchants to form the Ohio Company of Virginia. Thomas served as its first president and operational director. The purpose of the Ohio Company was geopolitical, to send traders and surveyors and eventually farmers across the mountains, establish fortified trading posts along the river valleys, and open the Ohio country for rapid, hopefully, English settlement. Thomas, trying to make this happen, sent a barrage of urgent letters to the Privy Council and the Lords of Trade in London, arguing that a massive land grant was necessary to circumvent French encroachment and extend the borders of the British Empire, as had happened, as he noted, to Virginia in its early days. Eventually, this relentless lobbying succeeded. The British Crown issued a royal instruction granting the Ohio Company an initial 200,000 acres of land, later increased to 500,000 acres, situated north and south of the Ohio River, in exchange for it agreeing to settle the territory and deal with the practicalities of that. So Thomas Lee had successfully committed the British Empire to a policy of westward expansion. He had drawn up the map of the future United States, utilizing a private commercial company to claim a continental empire. In September 1749, Thomas Lee reached the pinnacle of colonial political power. Following the departure of the long-serving royal governor, William Gooch, Thomas, by virtue of his seniority and preeminence around the council table, became the president of the council and the acting governor of Virginia. He was the head of the entire political, social, and economic hierarchy of the colony. There's an old, cherished, probably apocryphal tradition within the Lee family that King George II was so impressed by Thomas's vision and political acumen and all that he officially issued a royal commission appointing him the full titular royal governor of Virginia, a distinction that supposedly reached the shores of the colony after Thomas's death. It's unclear if that's true or a myth, though it's probably a myth. But what is clear and is true is that he was the first native-born Virginian to wield the supreme executive authority of the colony as acting governor. He was also still very much the restless man of always, the fortune builder on the move. In his 60th year of life, despite his expanding responsibilities, Thomas refused to remain trapped behind a governor's desk in Williamsburg and instead undertook a huge tour of observation across the entire Virginia colony, sailing down its rivers and sloops and penetrating its dense frontier forests on horseback. He gathered detailed data on the colony's extent, its population, its natural resources, its agricultural capacity, and compiled this research into a really comprehensive report that he dispatched to the Lords of Trade in London. It was something like Thomas Jefferson's much later Notes on the State of Virginia, one of Jefferson's most celebrated writings, which came about 50 years later. And through this report, Thomas was once again pressing his government to look past the coastline and embrace the westward destiny of the American people and Virginia. Then, in January of 1750, profound tragedy struck the master of Stratford Hall. His beloved wife, Hannah Harrison Ludwell, the woman who had stood alongside him through poverty, marriage alliance, the terrifying terror of the fire, the very long time it took to build Stratford Hall, passed away at the age of 49. Her death broke Thomas's spirit, and the physical stamina that had carried him through thousands of miles in the saddle began to fail rapidly in his grief. It was on November 14th, 1750, a mere 10 months after his wife's passing, that Colonel Thomas Lee died at Stratford Hall at the age of 60. He had written a detailed, very specific will that dictated exactly how he was to be returned to the earth, and explicitly rejected the pomp and circumstance of a governor's state funeral. Instead, he ordered that he be buried privately, without ceremony, in the old graveyard situated on the Machodoc property, the very field where his first home had burned to the ground decades earlier, a site known forever after as the Burnt House Field. I desire, he wrote, that last piece of human vanity be omitted, and that attended only by some of those friends and relations that are near, my body may be silently interred with only the church ceremony, and that a funeral sermon for instructions to the living be preached at the parish church near Stratford on any other day. Such is how he was buried, without the fanfare, shooting, and drinking typical of the time. Thomas Lee left behind an imperial domain, a staggering fortune in land that stretched from the shores of the Chesapeake to the falls of the Potomac, across the Allegheny Mountains. But his real legacy was much larger than that, which could be measured in acres or bricks. For his real legacy was the extraordinary band of brothers he and Hannah had reared inside the thick brick walls of Stratford Hall. They left behind 6 sons who had inherited their father's continental vision, his tireless energy, and his unyielding independence. It was Thomas Lee's sons who would stand around the tables of the Continental Congress, who would move the official resolution for American independence, and who would execute the treaties that secured the birth of a new nation. Casanova Gardner Lee, describing this legacy in Lee Chronicle, notes, quote, "Let us now consider the job done by Thomas and Hannah Lee in their task of bringing up a large family 2 centuries ago. They lost 3 children and reared 8, 6 sons and 2 daughters. Thomas Lee's family crest was a squirrel, and his own life one of tireless energy. He possessed a strong, inquiring mind and a powerful will. He had an abundance of vision, initiative, imagination, courage, and health, an inheritance from men who had matched their wits not only with nature, but with savages and rascals. He was able to pass on a fair amount of these qualities, all save health, to most of his children. Arthur Lee alone inherited a rugged body." End quote. The younger son, who had been left with nothing but a cow pasture, had built the houses that built America. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Please like this video if you liked it. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you again next time. Bye.